It is an all-out war. That's how Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Dayan describes an invasion of the Golan Heights and the east bank of the Suez by Syria and Egypt. The surprise attacks came early this morning in the air and on the ground. The Egyptians apparently have taken control of at least a portion of the east bank of the Suez. Dayan says it would take several days to drive them out of there, attributing the initial Egyptian successes to the thin line of Israeli defenses in that area. Egypt maintains it has taken control of the entire beach. On the Golan Heights, Syria claims it has taken some Israeli positions, but Israel says the Syrian attack now has been brought under control. As usual, there are conflicting reports on the casualties. Moshe Dayan called Israeli casualties reasonable. Egypt announced that it had lost 10 planes, but that it shot down 11 Israeli planes. Everyone agrees that this is the most serious fighting in the area since the Six-Day War of 1967, and that it developed rapidly. David Burrington reports on the mobilization in Tel Aviv.
All day today, Israeli reservists have been heading for their units. The streets have been full of military traffic. In fact, the big call-up started last night. Arab forces had been building up for 10 days, and intelligence indicated an attack was imminent. Israel could have struck first and gained the advantage, but this time the Israelis decided to wait. There's been no panic here, but people were uneasy and angry, especially angry that Arab armies would attack on this day, Yom Kippur, the most holy Jewish day. Newscasts told of heavy fighting, but details were hard to come by. The Army did disclose that 8 big Egyptian helicopters had been shot down with more than 200 casualties. Fighting very heavy on both fronts. Throughout Israel, there have been frequent air raid warnings today, the first time the sirens have sounded for real since the Six-Day War. Their wailing, in fact, was the first indication the Arabs had attacked. The sirens set off by Syrian MiGs striking across the Golan Heights. Generally, Israelis spend this holy day in the synagogue, but today many of them spent it in a bomb shelter. During one of the alerts, the Israeli cabinet was in emergency session. Tonight, Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Dayan agreed Egypt had gained 2 beachheads in Sinai and that Arab forces would undoubtedly get reinforcements through the night. Syrian tanks had also crossed the frontier. But once the Israeli army was up to strength, he said, the Israeli soldier would push them back. David Burrington, NBC News, Tel Aviv.
President Nixon has instructed Secretary of State Henry Kissinger to contact all parties involved in the fighting and try to arrange for a ceasefire. The president is keeping track of developments in the Middle East from his Key Biscayne, Florida home, and there are now indications that he'll return to Washington tomorrow. The resumption of the war in the Middle East is a serious setback of plans the president and Secretary Kissinger had for developing a new climate of peace in that part of the world. Richard Valeriani has a report.
Secretary Kissinger had planned to spend a quiet, private weekend in New York, but the Middle East crisis forced him to rush back to Washington. He spoke briefly with newsmen as he left.
We've told you everything that we can say. I'm in close touch with the president. If we have anything to say later in the day, we'll say it then, either in Washington or here at the United Nations.
Before leaving, Kissinger called the foreign ministers of Egypt and Israel to urge them to end the fighting as quickly as possible. He also called the Soviet ambassador in Washington, and he sent messages to King Faisal of Saudi Arabia and King Hussein of Jordan, apparently appealing to them to remain neutral. Earlier, State Department spokesman Robert McCloskey acknowledged the fighting caught American policymakers by surprise.
I must say, going back over the conversations that the Secretary has had here in New York with foreign ministers in the last several days, we never had any indication from any of the ministers that there was a military action intended by any of the governments. Indeed, the entire emphasis, as I'm sure those of you who have covered our activities here, the entire emphasis in the area of the Middle East was one of peaceful intention, one that emphasized the desire, certainly shared by us, that we hoped that diplomacy would become a little more active in that area and that negotiations toward peaceful settlements might be undertaken.
Up until last night, top-ranking American officials had figured that a new outbreak of fighting in the Middle East was virtually impossible. As one official put it, the Arabs don't want to commit suicide. And Kissinger had been working on a new American effort to bring about a long-range peace agreement in the Middle East following the Israeli elections at the end of this month. But that policy is down the drain now, and the first priority is simply to get the fighting stopped. Richard Valeriani, NBC News in New York.
American military officials insist that the U.S. Sixth Fleet will continue normal operations in the Mediterranean, but all shore leaves for the fleet now have been canceled. Sailors and officers have orders to report back to their ships. That was described as a precautionary move. At the Pentagon in Washington, the fighting is being watched very carefully, as we learn in this report from John Cochran in Washington.
American officials believe the renewed fighting was started by the Arabs, but Pentagon officials are not sure whether it's really all-out war or an attempt by the Arabs to regain a limited part of the territory they lost in 1967. Although today's attack came as a surprise, U.S. officials knew yesterday that Egypt and Syria were massing their troops. Also, the Russians appeared to be taking some of their advisors out of Egypt, a possible sign that the Russians knew an attack was coming and did not want to be identified with another military fiasco like the one in 1967. Reports on the air and ground battles received here are sketchy. About the only thing Pentagon officials are confident of is that the ultimate victor will be Israel. Although the Russians have supplied the Arabs with better military hardware than they had in the Six-Day War, U.S. intelligence estimates still give Israel the decided edge. And it's still believed here that Israel has better trained men and better command control. One Pentagon official said the Arabs have just never quite put it all together. Still, there are many unanswered questions. The Pentagon does not know if Egypt got enough of its tanks across to the east bank of the Suez to put up a major fight against Israel's armor. And there are reports of some North Korean pilots in Egypt. They could be flying some of Egypt's fighter jets. If so, that might slow Israel's attempt to reassert its air superiority as quickly as possible, a strategy Israel has followed in previous encounters. But despite the ifs and the questions, the Pentagon still believes that Israel will take command of the air, and that will mean victory on the ground, too. John Cochran, NBC News at the Pentagon.
Despite the fighting going on in the Middle East, the United Nations Security Council was not called into session today. The fighting broke out during the most important religious holidays of the year for both Jews and Arabs. For the Jews, it was Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. For the Arabs, it was Ramadan, a month-long religious observance and the most significant of the Muslim calendar.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.